In the sweltering summer of 1849, in the heart of Alabama's cotton country, a story began that would never make it into the official plantation ledgers, that would not be neatly catalogued in the courthouse records, and that white society would try, unsuccessfully, to bury. It is the story of a man named Joshua, an enslaved field hand who, according to both whispered testimony and the folklore that grew like wildfire after the event, did the unthinkable. He took a torch to the overseer's barn and burned him alive inside. What follows is not a sanitized history from the pages of textbooks, but the living memory of a tale passed down through scraps of journals, fragments of oral tradition, and the relentless human need to remember the defiance of those who were supposed to be forgotten. If you're new here, welcome to our channel, where we bring you the stories that history tried to erase. Make sure you subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is only one chapter in a much darker, much deeper saga of resistance, revenge, and survival. You don't want to miss the next tale that might just change how you see America's past forever. Joshua's story begins, as so many did, in bondage. By 1849, Alabama was one of the beating hearts of King Cotton, the empire that powered not only Southern wealth, but also the northern banks and European factories that processed the bales. Plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with cabins where the enslaved lived, and dominated by the looming big house. Every plantation had its hierarchy. The master, often absent or drunk on his own imagined superiority. The mistress, sometimes cruel in ways more subtle and cutting than the whip, and then the overseer. The overseer was the middleman of violence, hired to extract every ounce of sweat, blood, and obedience from the enslaved. Overseers were notorious for their brutality, often poor white men with little power elsewhere, who wielded the lash to prove themselves. It was said in Alabama that you could tell the measure of a plantation by the cruelty of its overseer. The plantation where Joshua labored was no exception. Accounts describe the overseer, his name lost to history but his cruelty not, as a man who relished punishment. He would ride through the fields on horseback, whip in hand, and it was said he kept a ledger not only of work quotas, but of lashes given, almost as though the beatings were his true measure of control. Joshua, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent, was a prime target. The overseer despised his quiet defiance. When others bowed their heads, Joshua met his eye. When others quickened under the whip, Joshua endured. That kind of defiance, even wordless, was dangerous.
And so, the seeds of fire were planted. Joshua's silence in the fields had always unsettled the overseer. But after that evening, after his younger brother's screams tore through the air and the boy's back was flayed open for all to see, something changed in him. It was not the moment a man snapped. It was the slow, quiet birth of a plan, a seed that took root deep in his chest, watered with rage and nurtured by the long nights in the cabins where whispers traveled like smoke and hope had to disguise itself as silence. In the folklore, the story begins with a punishment too far. One evening, after the day's picking, Joshua's younger brother, barely 14, was accused of hiding a handful of cotton. It was a common tactic. Overseers sometimes planted contraband to justify punishment, to remind the enslaved who held power. The boy was tied to the whipping post, the lashes fell, and Joshua, forced to watch, clenched his fists until blood ran from his palms. The overseer laughed, the sound grating like steel dragged across stone. Some say that was the moment the barn's fate was sealed, that in the eyes of the enslaved who watched, fire flickered in Joshua before it ever touched timber. The barn was the overseer's pride, a tall structure of timber and tar where he stored tools, grain, harnesses, and sometimes even slept on hot nights when the cabin air was too stifling. It was both symbol and sanctuary, a place he considered his fortress. And in the lore of the enslaved, barns were double-edged things. They were the overseer's domain, but they were also tinderboxes. A single spark could bring everything crashing down. Plantation owners lived in terror of fire. Fire meant rebellion. Fire meant the fragile illusion of control could be reduced to ash in minutes. Children of the enslaved were raised on hushed stories of plantations lit up like torches in the night, told by elders who claimed to have witnessed uprisings long ago. According to the legend, Joshua waited. He bided his time, pretending submission. Days passed, then weeks, and the plantation life droned on. Dawn in the fields, dusk in the cabins, the sound of chains, the smell of sweat, the silence of grief. Overseers like to say that the enslaved had no patience, no discipline. But patience was Joshua's greatest weapon. He worked, he bent his head, but inside he carried fire in his chest, hidden, smoldering, waiting. It was the night of July 21, 1849, when the act was set into motion. The overseer had drunk heavily. Some accounts say he was celebrating the punishment of another enslaved worker, boasting of how the man's cries could be heard all the way to the river, and had stumbled into the barn to rest. The air was thick and humid, mosquitoes rising in clouds, the stars hidden behind heavy clouds. Joshua moved silently across the yard, a torch hidden beneath his coat, his bare feet pressing into the dirt without sound. The dogs, strangely, did not bark. Some say he had fed them scraps earlier in the day, calming them with a quiet hand. He paused at the barn's door, and in that moment, the folklore says, he whispered a prayer, not to the overseer's God, not to the God invoked by those who justified chains and whips, but to his ancestors, to the spirits of Africa, to the strength of those who had endured before him. Some versions claim he spoke his brother's name aloud, a vow that his blood would not go unanswered. Then he set the torch to the dry straw. The flames caught quickly, climbing the walls with a hungry roar. The barn, seasoned by years of sun, was as dry as parchment. Inside, the overseer awoke, coughing, cursing, shouting for help. Some versions of the tale say Joshua barred the door with a beam, ensuring no escape. Others say he simply stood and watched, his face illuminated by the inferno, his expression unreadable. The overseer's shouts rose into a scream, then a bellow, then a raw animal howl. The night lit up, orange, the crackle of fire loud enough to drown the cicadas. By the time the alarm spread across the plantation, the barn was an inferno. The enslaved were shaken from their cabins, ordered to fetch water, to save what could not be saved. But the buckets moved sluggishly, some even passing hand to hand with deliberate slowness, as though the fire were a kind of justice they refused to extinguish. A woman dropped her bucket and claimed she tripped. A man walked to the river and back at half his usual pace. No one rushed. The overseer's name was never called in desperation, only muttered under breath, as if already consigned to the flames. When the fire finally died and dawn rose over the smoldering ruins, the overseer's body was found blackened, twisted, unrecognizable. His whip, once hung proudly by the barn door, was nothing but melted leather fused into ash. The plantation was thrown into chaos. The master, enraged, demanded answers. His voice echoed across the yard, threatening death to anyone who withheld the truth. The enslaved were questioned, threatened, whipped, but none spoke Joshua's name.
And Joshua himself, Joshua, was gone. Here the history ends, and the folklore begins. Some say Joshua fled that very night, using the cover of the fire to slip into the woods, guided by the North Star. They say he moved from plantation to plantation, aided by whispers of the Underground Railroad, until he crossed into free soil. One story places him in Cincinnati, working as a carpenter under a new name, his hands building instead of breaking, carving wood instead of dragging cotton. Another claims he made it all the way to Canada, where he lived to old age, telling his grandchildren the tale of the barn that burned. In those versions, his act of fire was not the end, but the beginning of a life remade.
But other versions are darker. Some say Joshua never left Alabama at all, that he stayed hidden in the swamps, a shadow that haunted the edges of plantations, striking terror into overseers who dared to ride alone at night. There are stories of barns mysteriously catching fire in the years after 1849, and each time the enslaved whispered, "Joshua." They said he moved like smoke, appearing and vanishing, a specter of vengeance. Some swore they saw him standing at the edge of the fields at dusk, torch in hand, eyes glowing faintly red. Still others believe his spirit lingered beyond flesh, that when the overseer burned, Joshua bound his own fate to the flames. There are tales from travelers who passed through that part of Alabama decades later, who claimed they saw a tall man standing by the ruins of an old barn, his face obscured, his eyes glowing like embers. Horses reared, dogs howled, and even the bravest turned their heads and rode faster. For them, Joshua had become more than a man. He was a warning, a haunting, the living memory of justice through fire. Whether Joshua survived in body or only in legend, one truth remained: his act could not be erased. Plantation owners tried to bury the story, to write it off as an accident, to scrub Joshua's name from the ledgers. But the enslaved carried it in their hearts, repeating it in whispers by the fire, passing it on like a secret gospel of resistance. In their telling, Joshua was not simply one man, but every man and woman who had dreamed of revenge and dared to imagine freedom. And this is the heart of folklore. Not whether every detail is verifiable, but whether the story carries the weight of truth. Joshua may or may not have lived to see freedom. He may or may not have barred that barn door himself. But what cannot be denied is that in the summer of 1849, a fire burned in Alabama, and from its ashes rose a legend that said the enslaved were not powerless, that even under the lash and the chain, the human spirit could strike back. Today, historians search the archives for traces of Joshua. They find fragments, mentions of a fire in a plantation records, unexplained deaths, sudden disappearances, a burned barn noted in the margin of a plantation ledger, a runaway slave reported missing, tall and broad-shouldered, last seen heading north. But the full story lives beyond the paper, in the oral traditions that have always carried the memory of the enslaved. It lives in the folklore of resistance, where Joshua stands not just as one man, but as a symbol of the countless who dreamed of revenge by flame, by blade, by flight. And so, when you hear the crackle of fire on a hot summer night, when you see the ruins of a barn in some forgotten corner of Alabama, perhaps you will think of Joshua, of the man who refused to bow, who lit a torch and who vanished into the smoke, leaving only whispers behind. If you've made it this far, then you're the kind of person who knows that history is more than dates and names. It's the stories we refuse to let die.
And here on this channel, we are committed to telling those stories in all their raw power, their pain, their defiance. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now. Join us, because next week we'll bring you another story, one that will chill you, haunt you, and remind you that the past is never as distant as we think. Turn on notifications, stay with us, and keep the fire of memory alive. Because Joshua's story is not over, and neither is ours.